The station had no name anymore. Whatever it had been called, waypoint, beacon, neutral ground, the war had eaten the name along with the outer hull and 3 of the 5 docking rings. Now it was just wreckage. A broken knuckle of metal floating between 2 clenched fists. Alia Voss had been inside it for 11 hours when the lights came back on. She was 23 years old, a level 2 mechanic assigned to the UES Ardent, and she had absolutely no business being alive. She knew this the way you know a dream is ending, not with certainty but with the sick feeling that certainty is coming. The shuttle that had brought her to the station for a routine supply run had been destroyed in the first volley of the ambush, along with its pilot, along with Lieutenant Kars, along with most of what she had thought her day would look like. She had run. She had sealed herself inside the station's maintenance corridor by instinct, by muscle memory, by the simple animal logic of a body that was not ready to stop. For 6 hours she had sat in the dark with her knees against her chest and listened to the war rearrange the architecture around her. Then the emergency power had flickered on, some buried battery finally deciding it had a job to do, and Alia had started moving. The station's main hub was a ruin. The observation deck had been breached, its panoramic windows replaced by stars. The communications array was a tangle of melted wire. The crew quarters were pressurized but empty, stripped by whoever had been here last. She found 2 ration bars in a storage locker, a single emergency pressure suit 2 sizes too large, and a portable welder that still had 40% charge. She found a maintenance schematic bolted to the wall near the engineering bay and she stared at it for a long time, her headlamp cutting through the half-dark, doing the math she did not want to do. 1 escape pod. Bay 7, port side. Emergency capacity, 2. She was already moving toward Bay 7 when she heard the sound. It was not a human sound. It was lower than that, more layered, a vibration that seemed to come from the walls rather than from any single point. She stopped. Her hand found the welder on her belt, not a weapon, but the only tool she had that could be held like one. The sound came again. And this time it was followed by the scrape of metal, the asymmetric rhythm of someone who was dragging one leg. She pressed herself into the shadow of a collapsed bulkhead and waited. The thing that came around the corner was tall. That was the first thing. Nearly 7 feet, with a frame that suggested mass without quite delivering it, lean in the way predators are lean, built for reach and speed rather than weight. Its skin was a deep charcoal grey, banded with darker striations at the joints, and in the emergency lighting it seemed to absorb the red glow rather than reflect it. It had 4 upper limbs, 2 functioning as arms, 2 folded at the shoulder in a configuration she had never seen outside of intelligence briefings. Its head was wide and low, with a jaw that split laterally rather than vertically, and eyes set far apart on the sides of the skull like a prey animal that had evolved into a predator and kept the architecture. Kor'Vaan. Combat grade, by the armor markings, though the armor was catastrophically damaged. The left side of the chest plate had been caved in. One of the secondary arms hung at the wrong angle. As it moved through the hub, it left a trail of something dark and slow on the floor, and it held one primary hand pressed flat against the wound in its side the way Alia herself had once held a cut on her palm as a child. The instinctive human gesture of contain the damage, and seeing that gesture on a thing that was not human made her chest do something complicated. It hadn't seen her. She could stay very still. She was good at very still. She had spent her childhood in engineering bays where the machines were louder than people and stillness was survival. She could let it pass. It was wounded. It might die on its own. It was the enemy. It had probably been on one of the ships that killed her pilot, that killed Lieutenant Kars, that had reduced her day to this corridor and this darkness. It stopped. It turned its head, the wide skull tilting on the long neck, and the far-set eyes swept the shadow where she was standing. She did not move. It made a sound. Short, low, interrogative. A sound that meant nothing to her linguistically and everything to her instinctively, because it was the sound of a creature that was exhausted and hurt and had just sensed that it was not alone, and was deciding, in real time, whether to attack or to collapse. She stepped out of the shadow. Not because she had decided to. Not because she had run the calculation and found this choice optimal. She stepped out because standing in the dark while a wounded thing decided whether to fear her felt like the worst possible version of herself, and she had enough to be ashamed of already. The Kor'Vaan went very still. Alia raised both hands, palms out, welder visible but not raised. She was aware that this gesture meant nothing to it. She was aware that she was a small human woman with a partial pressure suit and a 40% charge welder, and that this creature, even wounded, was significantly more dangerous than she was. She was aware of all of this, and she kept her hands up anyway. The Kor'Vaan watched her for a long moment. Then its legs buckled, and it went down on one knee, and its primary hand pressed harder against its side, and its head dropped forward, and something in the set of its shoulders communicated, across every gap of species and language and war, the simple fact of exhaustion so profound it had become a kind of surrender. Alia lowered her hands. She looked at it for another moment. She thought about Cass. She thought about the pilot whose name she could not remember right now and would not be able to remember until much later, when there was room in her head for grief. She thought about the 300 ships behind her and what they were waiting for. Then she walked over to the Kor'Vaan, not quickly, and she crouched down so she was not standing over it, and she looked at the wound. It was bad. She was not a medic. But she had grown up in engineering bays and she understood what happened when a containment breach went unaddressed, and the principle was not so different. The armor had been driven into the flesh, chitin-like, the briefings had said, but the briefings were wrong. It was nothing like chitin, it was more like layered carbon fiber grown organic, and it had splintered inward, and the flesh beneath it was doing something that flesh should not do, which was attempting to seal around the foreign material rather than expel it. She did not touch it. She pointed at it. She looked at the Kor'Vaan's face, at the lateral jaw, the wide eyes, the complex structure of brow ridges that were doing something she could not read, and she pointed at the wound and then she spread her hands in a gesture she hoped communicated this is a problem. The Kor'Vaan made a sound. Very quiet. She thought it might be agreement. She found what she needed over the next 40 minutes. The station's medical bay had been looted but not completely. There was a cauterization unit still in its bracket, and 2 pressure bandages, and something she could not identify but which appeared to be a broad-spectrum sealant used in EVA suit repair. She brought all of it back. She laid it on the floor beside the Kor'Vaan, which had not moved, which was watching her with those wide-set eyes that tracked each item as she set it down with an attention that was almost analytical. She pointed at the sealant. She pointed at the wound. She raised her eyebrows. The Kor'Vaan reached out, slowly, she was grateful for the slow, and picked up the sealant canister. It turned it in its long fingers. It looked at her. It made a sound she had no words for. She nodded. This was how it started. She learned its name, or what she would call its name, the syllable it used for itself, over the next hour, as they worked in the engineering bay with the schematic spread on the floor between them and the escape pod looming in its bracket overhead like a promise. The syllable was something like Vex, harder at the end, a click she could not quite replicate, but Vex was what her mouth could do, and when she said it the Kor'Vaan turned its head, so she kept saying it. It learned her name too. Alia became something slightly different in its mouth, the syllables redistributed, the stress landing on the second vowel. She answered to it anyway. The escape pod was in worse condition than the schematic suggested. Bay 7 had taken shrapnel damage in the initial exchange, and while the pod's hull was intact, its launch system was non-functional, its navigation array was dark, and its communication beacon had been physically separated from its housing. The fuel cell was at 62%, enough for a burn, not enough for a long one. She had the welder. She had 40% charge. She did not have anything like enough time. Vex, she discovered, was a soldier of considerable intelligence who happened to be bleeding internally and was furious about it. She discovered this because the way it approached the schematic was not the way a wounded creature approaches anything. It did not sit back, did not conserve, did not ration. It went at the problem with a focus that looked almost angry, its long fingers tracing the diagram with a precision that suggested either engineering training or the kind of mechanical intuition that transcends training, and it made sounds of clear frustration when it encountered the damaged sections, and once it slammed a fist on the floor so hard Alia felt the vibration in her boots. She said, "Hey." Not loudly. She said it the way she used to talk to the drive assembly on the Ardent when it was being difficult, not commanding, not pleading, just acknowledging the situation's difficulty. Vex looked at her. She held up one finger. She pointed to the schematic. She drew a slow breath. Vex made a sound. It had a quality she was beginning to recognize, something between acknowledgement and reluctant compliance. The Kor'Vaan equivalent of fine. They divided the work without language. She took the wiring, the communication beacon first, because if they got the pod launched without a beacon it was an escape pod full of 2 problems instead of a solution. The beacon housing had been partially melted. She used the welder on the lowest setting, feeling it in her wrists, aware of the charge counter ticking down. Vex took the launch system. She did not know what tools it carried, because she could not quite identify the instruments that came from a compartment in its damaged armor, but they were tools, clearly, and it used them with the economy of someone who had repaired things in bad conditions before. This was what surprised her most, in those first hours. Not the similarity of the gesture, not the way Vex pressed its hand to its wound the way she would have. That had surprised her in the first moment. But this, the way a Kor'Vaan soldier, combat grade, decorated or whatever they did instead of decorating, moved through a broken engineering bay with the same practice patience that she moved through one. The way it tested connections before soldering them. The way it cleared debris from a work surface before laying down a component. The way it checked and rechecked. She had been trained to think of the Kor'Vaan as the kind of enemy you could not reason with. This was official doctrine. They did not communicate, the briefings said. They did not negotiate. They had attacked 17 colony stations without provocation or warning, and they fought with a ferocity that made tactical withdrawal into a synonym for survival. All of this might still be true. She was not in a position to evaluate doctrine. She was in a position to watch Vex remove a damaged relay with 2 instruments she had never seen before, examine it, make a sound of clear disgust, and then begin fabricating a replacement from spare components with a patience and skill that she could only describe, honestly, as impressive. She said, without thinking, "That's good." She pointed at what Vex had done. "That's really good." Vex looked at her. Its wide eyes did the thing, the slight shift in the brow ridges, the change in the set of the lateral jaw, that she was beginning to read as something in the neighborhood of acknowledgement. It made a short sound. She went back to the beacon. 4 hours in, she made a mistake. She was tired. The beacon housing was almost sealed, but the internal calibration was off. The crystal oscillator had been knocked out of alignment, a micron-level problem that required a steady hand, and she had been awake for more than 20 hours, and her hand was not as steady as it had been, and she slipped, and the welder left a mark on the circuit board that should not be there. She said something unpleasant in a voice that was louder than she intended. Vex's head came up. She sat back and rubbed her face and looked at the damaged board and thought, 23 hours of oxygen left, 2 fleets waiting to kill each other, and I've burned out the calibration circuit on the only beacon. She thought this clearly and completely, and then she set the board down on the floor very carefully, the way you set down something fragile after you've already broken it. Vex moved. Slowly, it was moving carefully now, the wound doing something to its gait. It came around to her side of the pod and looked at the board. It crouched beside her, its secondary arms folding in the way they did when it was concentrating, and it examined the damage without touching anything. Then it reached into its armor compartment and produced something that was not quite tweezers and not quite a probe, a thin instrument with a self-heating tip, she realized, watching it, and it looked at her and made a sound that was clearly a question. She looked at the board. She looked at the instrument. She said, "Can you fix it?" Vex did not understand the words. But she thought it understood the shape of what she was asking. It held the instrument toward the board and raised its eyebrow structures. She sat back. She gave it room. She watched Vex work for 20 minutes in silence. The work was extraordinary. Whatever the instrument was, it allowed for a precision beyond what her welder could manage, and Vex used it the way she imagined a surgeon used a scalpel, not with dramatic gestures but with the total economy of someone who had done this for years, who had internalized the distance between too much and not enough so thoroughly that the line no longer required thought. When it was done, Vex held up the board. The calibration circuit was intact. Better than intact. The connection it had made was cleaner than the original. Alia took it. She looked at it. She looked at Vex. "Thank you," she said. Vex made a sound. Then it said something she could not understand, a sequence of sounds, low and complex, and looked at her with an expression she could not read, and she realized, with a kind of vertiginous surprise, that it was trying to tell her something. Not a functional communication. Not a request or a warning. Something with more weight than that. She said, "I don't know what that means." Vex watched her for a moment. Then it reached up and touched its own chest, just below the wound, and it said the sound again, shorter this time. A name, she thought. Not its name, that was Vex, or her approximation of it. This was something else. Someone else. She thought, it lost someone too. She did not know if this was true. She was projecting, probably. She was 23 years old and tired and scared and reading a face she had no frame for. But she thought about Cass, who had been 31 and had a sister in the outer colonies and always made too much coffee in the morning. And she held that thought for a moment. Then she held up the beacon board. She pointed to the remaining work. She raised her eyebrows. Vex dropped its hand from its chest. It made the sound that meant fine. They kept working. The 6th hour was when they found the food. She had explored more of the station than she realized, but there was a secondary storage compartment in the maintenance corridor that she had missed on her first pass, and when Vex discovered it, moving through the hub to retrieve a specific length of conduit, its head tilting at something she had not noticed, it spent a moment examining the sealed panel before pulling it open. Inside, emergency rations. 6 of them. Human spec, because this had been a human-administered station, in the dull grey packaging of standard fleet issue. Vex stared at them. It picked one up. It turned it in its fingers in the same way it had turned the sealant canister, that analytical examination, and then it held it out to Alia. She took it. She looked at it. She looked at Vex. She said, "We should split these." She held up 3 fingers, pointed to herself, held up 3 more, pointed to Vex. Vex's brow structures shifted. It reached back into the compartment and began removing the other 5, aligning them on the floor between them. It counted them. She watched it count, the gesture of an index limb moving over each one, and then it pushed 3 across to her side. She said, "These aren't going to work for you. They're human food." Vex looked at her. It picked up one of the ration bars on its side and brought it carefully to its lateral jaw. It split the jaw open. She tried not to flinch at how wide it opened, how many surfaces were working inside it, and it touched the ration bar to something that might have been a tongue. It was still for a moment. Then it made a sound she had not heard before. Something in a frequency she felt more than heard, a low vibration in the chest. She did not know if this was a sound of displeasure or a sound of surprise. She thought, she was almost certain, that it was a sound of amusement. It ate the ration bar. She watched it eat with the same sideways attention it had given everything else, assessing, categorizing. When it was done, it made the sound again. Shorter. She ate her own. Cold-pressed protein and something that was meant to taste like grain. She ate it in 4 bites and was still hungry afterward. She rummaged in her pocket and found the second ration bar she had found in the crew quarters earlier. Hers. She had been hoarding it, and she looked at it for a moment. She thought about being hungry later. She thought about the 12 more hours of work ahead of them. She held it out to Vex. Vex looked at it. It looked at her. Something shifted in the wide-set eyes. Not readable, still not readable. She was not going to pretend she could read it, but something. It took the bar. It pushed one of its own 3 across to her. She ate the replacement. It was dense and dark and tasted of nothing she had any reference for, something mineral and deep, and she chewed it slowly and decided it was not bad. Vex watched her. She thought it was waiting for a reaction. She gave it the only honest one she had. She nodded. Vex made the low-frequency sound again. Definitely amusement. The 8th hour was the worst. They had the beacon functional. They had the launch system partially repaired. Vex had been brilliant on the launch system, absolutely brilliant, had solved a fuel routing problem she had not even identified yet by some combination of intuition and whatever its training had given it. But the navigation array was dark, and without navigation they were launching a pod blind into the space between 2 fleets that were waiting to fire, and blind was not a metaphor she was comfortable with. Vex sat back from the navigation housing and made a sound she had not heard from it before. It was a sound without the analysis, without the economy. It was, she thought, a sound of depletion. She sat back too. For a few minutes neither of them moved. The emergency lighting pulsed its slow red. Somewhere in the station something structural groaned, the hull cooling, or contracting, or simply expressing what everything in the station had reason to express. Vex touched its wound. Not the way it had earlier, the containing gesture. Something slower. She watched its hand resting there and she thought about the complexity of being hurt in a place where there was no help. She reached into the pressure suit and found the small thing she kept there, a worn photograph, real paper, because her mother had been sentimental about analog things in an era of digital everything. Her mother and father and her at perhaps 7 years old, in a garden that no longer existed on a planet she had not been back to in 4 years. She held it for a moment, not showing it, just holding it. Then she held it out. Vex looked at the photograph. Its head tilted in that examining way. It looked at the 3 people in the image. It looked at her. It made a quiet sound and pointed at the youngest of the 3 figures. "Yeah," she said. "That's me." Vex looked at her. Then it did something she had not expected. It reached into a compartment in its armor, a different compartment, small, close to the body, the kind of compartment where you keep things you do not want to lose, and remove something small. It held it toward her. It was a piece of what appeared to be carved mineral. Smooth, dark, about the size of her thumb. Carved into a shape she could not quite resolve, something bilateral, something with an axis of symmetry, something that might have been a body. She took it carefully. She turned it over. The carving was extraordinarily fine. It was old. She could feel that in the weight of it, in the way the smooth places were differently smooth from the carved places, years of handling giving the surface a map of where someone's hands had returned again and again. She looked at Vex. Vex touched its chest. The same gesture as before. The same not its name sound. She held the carving for a moment and understood, or thought she understood, and handed it back very carefully. Vex took it and returned it to the small compartment with a deliberateness that confirmed everything she had been inferring. She said, "I'm sorry." Vex was still for a moment. Then it made a sound, not the frequency sound, not the analytical sound, something that existed in a register she had not heard from it yet, and returned to the navigation housing. She returned to the navigation array. She thought about 2 fleets waiting outside and all the small compartments in all the suits and armor and pockets on both sides. The navigation problem was, in the end, not a navigation problem. It was a targeting problem in reverse. Without the array, the pod could not navigate. But the pod did not need to navigate far. The pod needed to get from Base 7 to the space between the 2 fleets, and the space between 2 fleets was not a precise coordinate, it was a gap, and gaps were large, and what the pod needed was not pinpoint accuracy but good enough, and good enough was achievable without the array if she thought about it differently. She explained this to Vex by drawing on the floor. She drew 2 rough lines, the 2 fleets, with a gap between them. She drew a circle in the gap. She drew a line from the station to the circle. Vex stared at the drawing. It made the fine sound, but slower. More weighted. Then it reached out and modified the drawing. It added something to the circle in the gap, a few marks she couldn't immediately read. It looked at her and made a sound and pointed at the marks. She looked at the marks. She looked at the communications beacon she had repaired. She said, "You want to broadcast?" Vex looked at her steadily. "From the pod," she said. "Between the fleets. You want them to see us." Vex touched its chest. It touched her shoulder. Very brief, very light. It pointed to the gap in the drawing. "Both of us," she said. "The frequency sound. The amusement sound." "Yes." She sat with this for a moment. She thought about what it meant to be seen. She thought about 300 ships full of people with small compartments and worn photographs. She thought about the Kor'Vaan armada, which she had no framework for except the framework of an enemy, and she tried, sitting on the floor of a broken station between 2 wars, to imagine the small compartments inside that too. She said, "Okay." She almost said, "It won't work." She almost said, "They'll shoot us down." She almost said, "This is the worst plan I have ever heard from a person or an alien." She said, "Okay." The final 4 hours were brutal. The launch system needed one more fix, a hydraulic seal that Vex identified and she repaired, burning the welder down to 8% and making herself stop and breathe when her hands started shaking. The beacon needed to be configured for broadcast rather than distress signal, which was a function it technically had but had never been designed for, and she spent 90 minutes learning a system she had never trained on from a manual she had never read, in the red light, in the quiet that was beginning to feel like its own kind of communication. Vex flagged twice. The wound was doing something, she could tell, not dramatically, not with collapse, but with the particular still quality of a creature managing pain through concentration, burning willpower against physical reality. She made it stop and rest twice. The second time she handed it the last of the ration bars she had set aside. Vex looked at it. It made a sound. "Just eat it," she said. It ate it. It made the amusement sound, quieter than before. She thought about saying, "I don't know if this is going to work." She thought about saying, "I'm scared." She thought about everything she would say to another human in this situation, the specific textures of shared fear, the vocabulary you build with someone through crisis. She said, "Vex." It looked at her. She held up the photograph again. She pointed to her parents. She put the photograph away. She pointed to herself, "Here, now." She made a gesture she was not sure it would understand, palms out, head level, the physical posture of "I chose this, I'm choosing this, I'm here." Vex watched her for a long moment. Then it put its primary hand over the small compartment in its armor, briefly, and looked at her, and she thought, "Yes. Me too. Me too." They launched with 12% pressure suit integrity, a beacon running on a protocol she had never tested, a navigation system that was essentially a good push and a prayer, and a fuel cell at 62%. Base 7's doors opened outward into the space between everything, and for a moment Alia saw it whole. To her left, the human fleet, 300 ships in a formation she recognized from defensive protocols, their running lights burning cold white. To her right, the Kor'Vaan armada, which was not 3 ships or 30 but more, far more, their hull configuration strange and angular and vast, lit in frequencies she had not known ships could use for light, red amber deep, like the inside of something alive. And in the middle, nothing. The gap. The space where a war was waiting to start. She activated the beacon. The broadcast went out on every frequency she could configure. She did not know if it would reach them. She did not know if they were listening or if the listening systems were trained for signals rather than images. She set the beacon to broadcast visual and she turned to Vex in the cramped pod and she said, "They can see us now." Vex looked at the screen that showed the feed, the two of them, human and Kor'Vaan, in the small space of the pod, surrounded by the station's debris field, floating in the gap between everything. "It made a sound," she said. "What does that mean?" It made the sound again, looking at her, and she thought she would spend a long time trying to understand what that sound meant. She thought she might have a long time to spend on it. On the screen, she watched the feed. The pod had no weapons. The pod was barely a vehicle. It was a container, a gesture, two creatures in a metal box drifting between two armies and broadcasting the fact of their own survival. She thought about how easy it would be to fire. She thought about how she would not see it coming. She thought about Vex eating a ration bar with an expression of analytical surprise. She thought about the weight of the carved mineral in her hand and the fine work of the carving and the long years of someone's hands in the smooth places. She thought about Kars and the pilot whose name she had remembered now, Arian. She thought about them and let herself feel the grief of them, briefly, in the space between being afraid. She kept the broadcast running. She did not know, afterward, which fleet paused first. The record she would eventually see, the communications transcripts, the fleet logs, the accounts from ship captains on both sides who were trying to explain why they had not fired, described a kind of hesitation that spread like a wave. On the human side, confusion first, then recognition, then something else. On the Kor'Vaan side, she was told, there was a concept, she would spend years learning the word for it, that described the moment when violence is suspended not by agreement but by the overwhelming presence of something that should not be destroyed. The Kor'Vaan had a word for this and humans, she thought, did not, though they recognized the feeling. What the recording showed was this, a human mechanic and a wounded Kor'Vaan soldier, in a small escape pod, in the gap between two fleets, working on a communication board together. Not talking. Working. The mechanic's hands on the board, the soldier's instrument guiding her, both of their attention on the same object, the same problem, the same repair. Someone in the human fleet saw this and did not fire. Someone in the Kor'Vaan armada saw this and did not fire. The hesitation spread. Inside the pod, Alia watched the screen and did not know any of this yet. She knew only that they had not been destroyed, and that the gap was holding, and that Vex had put its hand on the schematic between them and was drawing something with its index limb, something she could not quite make out, curved lines, an axis of symmetry, something bilateral, and she watched its hand move and she thought, there is something it is trying to show me. She leaned forward. She looked at the drawing. She said, "What is this?" Vex made a sound. It pointed to the drawing. It pointed to both of them. It pointed through the hull in the direction of the two fleets. She looked at the drawing for a long time. She thought she understood it. She thought it was something like, this is the shape of what happens next. She thought it was something like, we made a thing that didn't exist before. She thought it was something like, hope, if you could draw hope, if hope had an axis of symmetry and bilateral structure, if hope was something you could sketch quickly on a navigation screen while two fleets held their fire and a beacon broadcast everything. She put her finger on the screen, on the drawing, tracing the curve. Vex made the frequency sound. Quiet. Outside, the gap held. She would learn, later, weeks later, months later, in rooms full of translators and diplomats and people with much more experience in historical moments than she had, that the broadcast had lasted 47 minutes. 47 minutes of the two of them in the pod, maintaining the beacon, making small repairs to the pod systems, existing in the space between two fleets without dying. The fleets had maintained position throughout. The Kor'Vaan armada had sent a query signal on a frequency the human fleet could receive. The human fleet had responded. The query and response were not the ceasefire. They were not even close to the ceasefire. The ceasefire was months away and required work that made the escape pod look like the easy part. But they were the first exchange of non-combat communication in the 8 years of the war, and they had happened because two fleets were watching a human and a Kor'Vaan share a navigation screen and did not, in that moment, know how to be only at war. She would learn all of this later. In the pod, she knew only that the beacon was running and the gap was holding and Vex was drawing on the screen, and that her suit integrity was down to 9%, and that she should probably address that. She reached for the patch kit. Vex, without looking up from the screen, reached out its secondary arm and held the suit steady while she worked. She patched the suit. She checked Vex wound, which was worse than it had been but not catastrophically so, not yet. She configured the beacon to continue broadcasting on automatic. She looked at the fuel cell, 51% now, enough for a long burn, enough to get somewhere. She looked at Vex. It was looking at the screen. At the drawing. At the bilateral shape of whatever it had meant to show her. She said, "Where do we go?" Vex looked at her. It pointed to the drawing, and then it pointed through the hull, not toward either fleet, but to one side, out into the space beyond the standoff, the open dark between the claimed and the unclaimed. She said, "That's not a destination." Vex made the fine sound. She made a sound back at it, something she did not plan, something her throat produced spontaneously that was apparently her version of the frequency sound, the amusement sound, because Vex's brow structures shifted and it looked at her with something that might have been startled and might have been delighted, and she thought, "I will spend a long time learning what that looks like." She said, "Okay." She looked at the gap between the fleets, holding. She looked at the beacon, broadcasting. She looked at the drawing on the screen, the curved lines, the bilateral shape of what came next. She set a course for nowhere in particular. They went.